Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Vibe Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Kara Cooney. And today we'll be discussing her course with Myth Vision podcast titled Ancient Egyptian Cosmogony and Cosmology. The affiliate link to purchase the course will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Kara Cooney.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Yeah, of course. And can you tell us a little bit about what exactly is the course about? What do the Egyptians say about cosmogony and cosmology?
Yeah, creation mythologies are just such a cool and interesting way of looking at the world and where humanity fits in the world, because every culture has its own understanding of creation, how the world was brought into being. And creation, the mythology of creation, tells you as much about the divinities who created as anything else. It gives you an idea of how the ancient people thought the world was organized. And male and female, who came first, light and dark, all of these things play a part in the cosmogonies, the creation mythologies. And tracking those for ancient Egypt gives you a complicated and really interesting picture that we can compare to a Judeo-Christian Islamic mindset.
Is the Egyptian viewpoint on cosmogony and cosmology similar to that of other ancient cultures in their time period, or is it a bit different?
In some ways, it's very similar in that you have creation from nothing, and that creation is a very masculine endeavor, very similar to the Hebrew Bible, and a lot of Judeo Christian ideas. And then in other ways, it's much more visceral and bodily, in that the earliest creation mythology, which we call the Heliopolitan creation mythology, that which comes from the ancient Egyptian city of Iunu, in the north, near Memphis, just north of Memphis. That mythology has the god Atum creating himself sexually from himself. And that's very different from what you would see in the Hebrew Bible creation mythologies, and has more connection to indigenous creation mythologies before people were afraid of sex or talking about sex. And we have people, the ancient Egyptian people, who understood that if you want to create something, you have a sexual union, and that sex then creates. The ancient Egyptians then thought, okay, we have one masculine entity. How is he going to have sex? And they very clearly state that he has sex with his own hand. So it is a masturbatory event of creation, the likes of which you will not see in the Hebrew Bible, in any sorts of New Testament discussions, in the Quran, in the Book of Mormon. These things are not going to be in those Judeo-Christian Islamic Mormon texts.
What did the Egyptians say about the gods and the circumstances of the universe's origin?
It's pretty interesting. For that, I would look at the Hermopolitan creation mythology and look at the ancient Egyptian city of Shmun, or Hmun, which is where Thoth dwells. And there you have the understanding of the four elements of pre-creation. You have infinity, darkness, primeval matter, and hiddenness or unknowableness. And these four elements all had male and female pairs, which means they could have sex with one another and create something. But within that entity of a kind of a black, dark soup of pre-creation that went on forever, that couldn't really be understood, that was infinite, within that, then you take that Hermopolitan creation mythology, you can add the Heliopolitan, because within that you have an entity that comes to know himself within that primordial soup, if you will. And then he's the one that creates himself. In the Hermopolitan creation mythology, he is created by the Ogdoad, the 8 primeval beings of pre-creation. They put him in an egg, and that egg then it hatches, and that's where you get creation, that God then creates himself within that primordial mass. In the Heliopolitan, you get Atum, or Amun-Re in a Theban version thereof, and then he creates himself. One of the most confusing things about Egyptian creation mythology, and the coolest part for me, is how many different creation mythologies there were, and how the ancient Egyptians didn't have any problem with that. They didn't think, oh, there can only be one way and one story. they had overlapping stories depending on location, place, and divinity. So each divinity could have a different creation mythology, and that divinity needed to continue creation. And all of these creation mythologies could be true. I mean, Jacob, that's one of the most interesting things about Egyptian creation mythology in comparison to the Hebrew Bible, is that creation for the Egyptians was never finished. It had to constantly be repeated. And every temple that was built, every obelisk that was set up, every statue of a god that was created was there to continue this creation experience so that people could bring the sun's light in a repeated fashion into the world. They could bring the Nile flood in a seasonal fashion into their world. And without that, they had nothing.
What do we know about the Ennead and the divine relationships?
The Ennead's really, really cool. The Ennead is just a Greek word for the nine. And these are the nine gods associated with the Heliopolitan creation mythology. The god who's really at the apex of that is Atum. And Atum is the one who sexually creates himself. He then sneezes out a sunlit void, which is called Shu, and he spits out a feminine moisture element that fits into that sunlit void named Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut then have sexual relations with each other, and they produce Geb and Nut. So now we're at five, right? Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut. Geb and Nut are earth and sky. And it flips what you have in a Western cosmogony or cosmology, in that the earth is the god, not an earth goddess. And the sky is not a Zeus-like figure with lightning bolts, but a woman or a cow goddess that vaults her body across the sky. And those two, Geb and Nut, then have sexual relations with each other, and they produce four more divinities to round out the nine. And there you have Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, and that's the Ennead. And then the 10th member of the Ennead, if you like, is of course Horus. He is the hawk god who is produced by sexual relations with Isis and Osiris after his death and dismemberment by Seth. She puts him back together, creates a penis for him, and then climbs on board as a hawk and conceives Horus. And he is the god who represents kingship on earth. So if you like, you can think of the Ennead as that which sources leadership of the heavens down to the earth and creates the authority of God-given rule.
What did the Egyptians say about the concepts of time, seasons, and the stars?
They did everything with the stars and the seasons. They organized their lives around the stars and the seasons. And one thing I mentioned in the course is how cut off we are from these things with the amount of light pollution that we have. I live in the city of Los Angeles. You can imagine the light pollution here is worse than in most American cities. We can't look up at the vault of the heavens and see a blanket of stars anymore. We're lucky if we can see the planets moving through the ecliptic. For the ancient Egyptians, the Milky Way was a river of the sky upon which the planets sailed and upon which the divinities moved. And everything was organized according to the movements of the fixed stars and the planets across that vault. And the Egyptians invented the decans, which is, if you study astrology, you learn that we separate the 360 degrees of the ecliptic into 12 different zodiac signs of 30 degrees each. And the Egyptians, before that Greek system, they had separated up into 30 different, so that each zodiac sign, as we have it in the Western system, had an additional 3 subdivisions. And every 10 days, a new decan rose. And the Egyptians organized their week according to the 10-day decan. And you would have 9 days of work and a day of rest, as opposed to 7 days of work with 1 day of rest. And they organized their seasons according to the decans as well. They invented the calendar that we know, 360 days for those 36 decans of 10 days, plus 5 extra days. that amount to the 365-day calendar. They were aware of the problem of leap year, and they weren't quite able to solve it. So you actually have the Egyptian scribes saying it's winter when it should be summer according to our calendars, and they knew that their calendrics were off, and thus they followed the moon for a more accurate timekeeping device. But the stars, the sun, the moon, the heavens, all of this was a way that the ancient Egyptian people lived symbiotically within the world, as opposed to looking at their iPhones and their blue screens. And I mean, that's how we know what time it is, right? You tap your phone and you know exactly what time it is. We don't even have to think about daylight savings time anymore and really changing our clocks, because our phones do it for automatically. Even though we shouldn't have daylight savings time to begin with, it's such a strange way of trying to control the time of the universe rather than living with it symbiotically.
What do we know about their funerary practices and afterlife beliefs?
That's actually going to be the subject of another course that I do, Jacob, because there's so much that we can say about funerary beliefs, afterlife studies. And this is a course that does bring afterlife beliefs into discussion, because so much of what we know about cosmology and cosmogony comes from Book of Earth, Book of the Day and Night, Book of the Dead, the coffin texts, and the pyramid texts. So because the ancient Egyptians were always trying to create a plan B, plan C, plan D for rebirth in the next life, many of the texts we have about creation and recreation come from funerary texts. The two are inextricably linked, inextricably entwined. Um, but ancient Egyptian understandings of death and the afterlife, I would say, in a nutshell, are about rebirth, which is why we have to use those texts to look for creation mythologies. It means that every time a man or woman or child died in ancient Egypt, they would connect their next life, their rebirth, with the creation of the gods themselves, such that every ancient Egyptian individual became like Osiris, became an entity who could recreate himself from death, from nothing, and create another generation, an extension of himself. So if you were to die, Jacob, and you had an ancient Egyptian coffin made for you, you would be called Osiris Jacob. and and that would be inscribed on your coffin, and that would connect you with the creation possibilities that Osiris had within his mythologies, and endow you with those same gifts so that you could be reborn in the next life. The ancient Egyptians didn't really divide divinity from humanity. I mean, they did, like any other civilization. We are mere tiers of the divinity, but we are also of the divinity in the Egyptian conception, such that we can return to that source and we can connect and be with that source as well.
So can you tell us about the comparative study with modern beliefs? What kind of Egyptian concepts of let me rephrase. When you look at Egyptian concepts of creation and existence, what kind of parallels does it have with modern religions?
Yeah, there's a lot there. When we talk about the creation of light and dark and the separation of light and dark, you can see that Hebrew Bible conception, you can actually see that in the ancient Egyptian. When you see a separation between earth and sky, you see that in the when you see the separation between earth and sky, you see that also in the Egyptian creation mythologies. And when you see a separation between male and female, human entities, you see that in the Egyptian mythologies. How they work in their details is different, but in a larger scheme of things, you do have the same steps, that you come from this primordial infinite mind of God, and then you separate and divide and create things that are of that impenetrable and unknowable divine source. And the more you divide, the more it can be known that this is a divinity associated with war, and that is a divinity associated with writing, or this is a a woman and that is a man, or this is a fish and not a cow. All of this division and subdivision and specialization is the creation story. And it's what humans like to do. We like to categorize. We like to put things in their own little boxes of purpose and physical form. And the forms are simply separated more and more. The way I would describe every creation mythology being united is that we human beings, if we are part of a divine source in the mythological sense, and we know we've come from some some larger unknowable divine entity, it is creation mythology that helps us to know where we fit in the hierarchy, how we are to understand our place in the divine schema. And the further back we go, so we know that we're people, and before that, this or that god created us, and before that there was this separation between light and dark and all of these things. The farther back you go into the creation mythology, into pre-creation, the more unknowable and unreachable it actually is, such that if we were to talk to indigenous people here in California, they would have a similar understanding of an unknowable divinity as a source. But if you separate it out, I can talk to the god of the river, I can talk to the god of the ocean, but the unknowable is harder to reach. And creation helps us to separate and pinpoint where we fit and how to talk to divinity in a separate capacity rather than trying to talk to the unknowable God. That's when it gets a little tricky for most people.
How is their art, religion, and symbolism intertwined?
The art, religion, and symbolism for the ancient Egyptians are completely intertwined in that they the language itself is artistic. The Egyptian hieroglyphic system is a system of images that represent exactly those subdivisions of the human realm or the earthly realm and heavenly realm hierarchically. So if you Google Egyptian hieroglyphs and you look at the categorization that Sir Alan Gardner applied to those hieroglyphs, you see the creation mythology in the hieroglyphs themselves, which is this is a really cool question that you've asked, Jacob, because you're looking at um, Gardner's scheme of hieroglyphs. You see at the top divinity, and you see all of the different images, hieroglyphic images of divinity. You could have a sun globe with the rays. You could have the seated god. You could have the seated goddess. You have different fetishes that represent divinity and other divine things. You could have that flag, that wrapped flag that is Netcher, the sign for God in ancient Egyptian language. And then you move down the hierarchy, and you have images of humanity, different things that men and women can do. You separate into genders. You can show a man fighting. You can show a woman giving birth. These are all hieroglyphic images, and they're all a part of creation. And then also a part of that hierarchy are the elements of the heavenly realm, the vault of the sky, the stars in the vault of the sky, the Bia, which is the miracle of a meteor coming to Earth, different stars or constellations, and there are hieroglyphs for all of these things. And then different earthly elements. There are hieroglyphs that represent the river, hieroglyphs that represent an island in the river, land, different kinds of land that you can sow with grain, or land that is meant for marsh, and that's where a different kind of life dwells, a source of life of a different kind. And and it goes on and on. There's hieroglyphs for salamanders. There's hieroglyphs for different kinds of snakes. There's so many hieroglyphs for different birds that Egyptologists have to become a tiny bit of an expert on different bird species. I never bird watched or cared about birds before, but because I'm an Egyptologist, I actually have to pay attention to different bird species and know, oh, that's the Bennu bird versus that's the Ahu bird, or that's the hare bird for the hawk, and and so on and so forth. So the entire cosmos is represented in the hieroglyphic system artistically, and it is there encoded in little tiny beautiful pictures, all of the good and the bad and the ugly of how humanity experienced the world in the ancient Egyptian way. And Yeah, that's why learning hieroglyphs is also an introduction into how the ancient Egyptians categorized their cosmos.
And lastly, what do we know about their view of order and chaos?
This is a tricky one, and it's one that, we when you think of order, you think of something that's good and what we want. And when you think of chaos, you think of that which can't be controlled and which creates problems and something which we don't want. The ancient Egyptians would often turn this on its head, because chaos is also the source of the divine. It is the elements of pre-creation. It is where Osiris's ability to be reborn comes from. It's where the source of the Nile flood comes from. That pre-creation, that chaotic source is everything. But then when it comes into the world, if it comes in as chaos, then it's frightening. It's too much to contain, to control, and it can actually burn you, like the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun and having his wings of wax melted and he falls to the earth. You can only connect with that chaotic primordial mass so much without it absolutely destroying your mind. And so the Egyptians order it, and they order it with their hieroglyphic system, with their system of rule and their organization of bureaucracy and legal systems. And this is the way to make the world ruled, navigable, something that a state can control. And this dialectic between the ordered and the chaotic is everything. It is how we understand the ancient Egyptian system, but it's also how we understand our human place in the world, in any different system of cosmogony and creation mythology. Order versus chaos is what it's all about. You look for the order, but too much order is boring. You don't get new life coming in that way. You always have to look back to the chaos as well. It is a back and forth feedback loop, if you like.
And I just like to remind everyone real quick. Like I said at the beginning, if you want to purchase the course, the affiliate link is in the description below and in the pinned comments to purchase the Ancient Egyptian Cosmogony and Cosmology Myth Vision course. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Kara Cooney.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Thanks for having me on.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.